Okay, now we are back and we are going to continue the ethics focus on subjectivity versus objectivity of moral judgments, which is what Edward and Paps want to look at in our intro to ethics course. Um, the next essay is called the indefinability of good, right? So we already know he's going to be looking at it, say, does good mean something that we can nail down? Well, that term by G.E. Moore. Good is a simple notion. Elena and I talked about what the word simple means, I think, yesterday. Is that where it came up? Yes, yes. David Hume was mentioning the word simple. So it would be worth taking a pause here and saying, what the heck does the word simple mean in philosophy? And as Mark was talking in the pre show, there's an awful lot of philosophy that is, a lot of riches in philosophy have come from medieval theology. And the word simple is one of these terms that we should take a moment to know what it means in a philosophical context. When philosophers are using the word simple, they mean something kind of different than we normally mean it to mean. So let me talk about simple. Simple means has no parts. Simple means has no left side and no right side. No up and no down, no north and no south. Nothing. There's no way of by. It's not made of parts. It's simple. It doesn't have a length, breadth, and width. Right? It doesn't have a left side and a right side. It's not in a location exactly or something like that. So the theologian said God is all powerful. He's all knowing. He's this, he's that. He's simple. Whoa, simple. They called God simple. And they said, well, yeah, we figured it out. He's not like a body. He's well, they would use different terms. Some might say spirit, some might say other things, but whatever he is, he's simple. He doesn't have a location, length, breadth, and width. There's no top side and bottom side. So then they started talking about his attributes. Are attributes the right word? Oh, shoot. Oh, I can't get this word wrong. Hold on a second. I wanted to focus on this word. Hold on. Yeah, attributes. Yeah, okay. Attributes is the right word. Okay. They talk about God's attributes because they attribute these things to God. But the reason why they say attributes instead of characteristics or qualities is that the medieval theologians and philosophers identified that God's love is not different from his justice. It's not different from anything you say about God. He's one thing. So his love and his envy are the same thing. His love and his anger are the same thing. His love and his justice are the same thing because God is simple. It's not like at one time he has one feeling and at another time another, or at one time he has one characteristic and at another time another. We're not saying this has to be true, but the word simple was defined and refined in philosophy and in theology and the conversation between the two in the Middle Ages. And so when a philosopher even today uses the word simple, like G.E. Moore is doing right now, he's talking about that. And that's all of those associations are going to come into the mind of anybody who is read in philosophy and is in this conversation. So at first it might say good is a simple notion. Now we know what he means. What he means is like Plato talking about the good, right? It's the same thing. It's clearly he's talking about the arche. He's talking about this divine thing. The idea that it's simple is one of the attributes, right? So God's all-knowingness is the same as his omnipresence. They're attributes. We attribute them to God because we are limited. And so we see at these different facets, but God doesn't actually have different facets. He's one thing. Okay. So good is a simple notion. What then is good? How is good to be defined? Now, it may be thought that this is a verbal question. A definition does indeed often mean the expressing of one's word's meaning in other words. But this is not the sort of definition I am asking for. Such a definition can never be of ultimate importance in any study except lexicography. If I wanted that kind of definition, I should have to consider in the first place how people generally use the word good. but my business is not with its proper usage as established by custom. I should, indeed, be foolish if I tried to use it for something which it did not usually denote. If, for instance, I were to announce that whenever I use the word good, I must be understood to be thinking of that object which is usually denoted by the word table. I shall therefore use the word in the sense in which I think it is ordinarily used, but at the same time, I am not anxious to discuss whether I am right in thinking that it is so used. My business is solely that with that object or idea which I hold, rightly or wrongly, that the word is generally used to stand for. What I want to discover is the nature of the object or idea. And about this, I am extremely anxious to arrive at an agreement. So we said in our introduction to this introduction to ethics that we could cut ethics into four sections: some foundational, what's the basis or the grounding of ethics, actual specific ethical questions, meta ethical conversation, which is mostly what we're doing here, but then also the summum bonum, like the ultimate good, good qua good. And so he's saying, look, I don't want to define it and see how we use it. I want to say, what is this thing that we're talking about? And it's possible that he means it in that way. If we understand the question in this sense, my answer to it may seem a very disappointing one. Okay, so he actually is just saying, look, what's the idea? What's the general idea in our heads? So maybe not the summum bonum. If I am asked what is good, my answer is that good is good. That is the end of the matter. Or if I am asked, how is good to be defined? My answer is that it cannot be defined. And that is all that I have to say about it. But disappointing as these answers may appear, they are of the very last importance. To readers who are familiar with philosophic terminology, I express their importance by saying that they amount to this: that propositions about the good are all of them synthetic and never analytic. And that is plainly no trivial matter. And the same thing may be expressed more popularly by saying that if I am right, then nobody can foist upon us such an axiom as that pleasure is the only good, or the good is the desired, on the pretense that this is the very meaning of the word. Let's pause for a minute. He brought up the analytic synthetic distinction, and we've never taken a moment to talk about that. It's going to be pretty straightforward. Things that are synthetic are about, actually, what's it? Okay, so when he says that the propositions about the good are always synthetic and never analytic, an analytic statement is about definitions. It's about ideas alone and not having to be attached to something in the world. So the shortcut version is the synthetic is about something. It's pointing at something else, right? So a synthetic statement could be something like the gene is the basic unit of information for biological organisms, right? I'm talking about the world. That's not axiomatically true, right? It's just I'm pointing at something else. But if I say something like there never was a bachelor who is married. There's all bachelors are unmarried men. Like you don't have to go investigate that. I'm just telling you what the definition of the term is, right? And what he's saying is that every proposition about the good is in that first category. It's synthetic. It's about the world. He says there's no such thing as a definition. You can't have, if Mill comes along and says the good is increasing happiness or pleasure or something like that, those statements, he doesn't think they mean anything. So let's see why he says that. Let us then consider this position. My point is that good is a simple notion, just as yellow is a simple notion, that just as you cannot, by any manner of means, explain to anyone who does not already know it what yellow is, so you cannot explain what good is. Definitions of the kind that I was asking for, definitions which describe the real nature of the object or notion denoted by a word, and which do not merely tell us what the word is meant to mean, are only possible when the object or notion in question is something complicated, something complex. You can give, so the way he's using the word simple is a lot like the way we've seen the word basic being used, right? So this is basic. You can't, there's nothing underneath it to prop it up. You found ground level. When you're talking, when you're using the term good, there's not other notions that make up the word good. This is like yellow. Yellow, you can talk about yellow all the time. You can make synthetic statements about yellow. The sensation of seeing yellow will be triggered when wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation hit your retina between 113 and 127. I'm making up numbers. I have no idea. Nanometers or something, right? You can make synthetic statements about yellow, but you can't say what yellow is unless it's something that a person already knows in that other kind of knowing sort of way, right? Okay. He says good is like that. Let's see. I don't want to get lost here. Okay. Yellow. You can, You can give a definition of a horse because a horse has many different properties and qualities, all of which you can enumerate. But when you have enumerated them all, when you have reduced a horse to its simplest terms, then you can no longer define those terms. They are simply something which you think of or perceive. And to anyone who cannot think of or perceive them, you can never, by any definition, make their nature known. It may perhaps be objected to this that we are able to describe to others objects which they have never seen or thought of. We can, for instance, make a man understand what a chimera is, although he has never heard of one or seen one. You can tell him that it is an animal with a lioness's head and body, with a goat's head growing from the middle of its back, and with a snake in place of a tail. But here, the object which you are describing is a complex object. It is entirely composed of parts, with which we are all perfectly familiar: a snake, a goat, a lioness. And we know, too, the manner in which those parts are to be put together, because we know what is meant by the middle of a lioness's back, and where her tail is wont to grow. And so it is with all objects not previously known, which we are able to define. They are all complex, all composed of parts, which may themselves, in the first instance, be capable of similar definition, but which must, in the end, be reducible to simplest parts, which can no longer be defined. So it's basic. That's what he means here, right? By simple. But yellow and good, we say, are not complex. They are notions of that simple kind, out of which definitions are composed and with which the power of further defining ceases. Let's pause for another quick moment. Was it Anselm who made this argument? I'm sorry, one moment. Okay, so this is kind of fun. In the second year, we read through Descartes' Meditations, and Nietzsche said something quite interesting about Descartes, which is he also had a problem with "I think, therefore I am," just like David Hume was having yesterday in our other class, Elena. But it was the same problem. He resolved it differently, I think, maybe, but it was the same problem. But in any case, what Nietzsche said was, but if you have that, if he's right about "I think, therefore I am," then certainly God exists. Everything else he says is correct. Which is usually not what people do when they deal with Descartes and are trying to dismiss him. They usually are fine with the "I think, therefore I am" part, and then they try to find a problem with the 27 premises of the proof of God's existence that follows immediately after that, by the way. He doesn't need to know anything else besides that, and then to continue meditating to discover God's existence. But In the notion of God's existence, in the argument for God's existence that Descartes has, it's very interesting. He makes this similar point that he's making here. He says, look, I can tell you what a unicorn is, and you can imagine a unicorn. There never was a unicorn, as far as anybody knows. But it's easy. You know what a narwhal is, you know what a rhinoceros is, and you know what a horse is. And you can take a part of the rhinoceros, the horn, and you can attach it to the concept of the horse, and you got a unicorn, basically. And isn't that wonderful? And he says, but that's how your imagination works. Your imagination has to build up out of things it has experienced and has known. There's no way that you could have, like, you can imagine a gold mountain because you know what gold is and you know what a mountain is. But it's hard for me to give you an example of something you can't imagine because I can't come up with the example. But he notices a limitation to your imagination, which is that it always has to be rooted. When I say imagination, I don't just mean like a childish game, right? It's the capacity for conceptualization in your mind is always rooted in something that you know in that other kind of a way. And then from that, Descartes says, well, I have this idea in my mind of an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good and pure, simple. It was important to his argument that it be simple entity, this notion of God. I have this idea of him. Where the hell did I get that from? I'm not like that. Nothing I've ever experienced is like that. The conclusion has to be, after examination, that there must be something like that which has left its imprint upon me for me to even have the idea in the first place. He's literally, that's his argument. He's so I know I exist as a thinking thing, and he looks around the rooms of the ideas and notions he has. He says, whoa, here's a weird one that's not like any of the others. Where the hell did that come from? So in any case, we see the point that's being made, right? And what Moore is saying is, so when he's saying simple, he's maybe more saying basic, but the idea is that there's no underneath this. The quality of this thing can't be talked about in terms other than the thing itself. It's like yellow. Yellow, you could learn everything about yellow that you could say synthetically about it, but if you've never seen it, this is a different argument also in the philosophy of mind that we'll be getting into called the qualia argument, where it says, look, if you've never had the experience of the quality of seeing yellow, there's something you don't know still. And that's a debate, people, but that's the debate. That's the argument put forward by the qualia people, which is an anti-AI argument. It's like you can use the words, but do you know what they mean, kind of a thing. We won't get into that now, but we see how intertwined all these ideas are. So he's making that argument. He's saying, look, you can have a unicorn in your head because you know what a horn is and you know what a horse is, but the basic notions are things that you just know them or you don't. And I think good is like that. So this is how he's going to approach this question of, are these things subjective or objective? And it's similar to that idea the deontologist gave us of, well, maybe you've got a faculty that instinctively understands things or whatever. It's similar in that sense. But what he's saying is that's just the nature of good. And good is like yellow. Good is something that you can try to pry it up or define it away or anything, but all of that conversation is a waste of time because it just is, and you perceive it or you don't. Okay, let's move on. Anybody want to say anything before we move on? Actually, I'm gonna find my place here. Okay, here we are. When we say, as Webster says, the definition of horse is a hoofed quadruped of the genus Equus, we may, in fact, mean three different things. We may mean merely, when I say horse, you are to understand that I am talking about a hoofed quadruped of the genus Equus. This might be called the arbitrary verbal definition, and I do not mean that good is indefinable in that sense. Two, we may mean, as Webster ought to mean, quote, when most English people say horse, they mean a hoofed quadruped of the genus Equus. This may be called the verbal definition proper, and I do not say that good is indefinable in that sense either, for it is certainly possible to discover how people use a word. Otherwise, we could never have known that good may be translated by gut in German or gut, I'm sorry, in German, or bon in French. But 3, we may, when we define horse, mean something much more important. We may mean that a certain object, which we all of us know, is composed of in a certain manner, that it has 4 legs, a head, a heart, a liver, etc., all of them arranged in definite relations to one another. It is in this sense that I deny good to be definable. I say that it is not composed of any parts which we can substitute for it in our minds when we are thinking of it. We might think just as clearly and correctly about a horse if we thought of all of its parts and their arrangement instead of thinking of the whole. We could, I say, think how a horse differed from a donkey just as well, just as truly in this way as now we do, only not so easily. But there is nothing whatsoever which we could so substitute for good. And that is what I mean when I say that good is indefinable. It's simple. It's basic. It's the thing. It's more real, or it's like that idea of simple. That's why we spent a little bit of time looking at simple, but it's basic and simple. Okay. I'm afraid I have not I have still not removed the chief difficulty which may prevent acceptance of the proposition that good is indefinable. I do not mean to say that the good, that which is good, is thus indefinable. If I did think so, I should not be writing on ethics, for my main object is to help towards discovering that definition. It is just because I think there will be less risk of error in our search for a definition of the good that I am now insisting that good itself is indefinable. I must try to explain the difference between these two. So we can see where he's going. He's going to say, we can have conversations about whether or not this is yellow or whether or not this is yellow, but that's available to us still. Let's have those debates. Let's figure that out. But what is yellow? Yellow is yellow. At the end of the day, it's yellow. You can make all sorts of synthetic statements about it. Yellow is the sensational experience you have when electromagnetic radiation of certain nanometers strikes your eye. Yellow is the predominant light that filters through the atmosphere from stars that are between this temperature and that temperature. You can make all sorts of statements about yellow, but what is yellow? Where does yellow? It's basic. It's simple. It's just you know it or you don't. He said that's what good is. Now that if he can establish that, which he's going to try to finish establishing here, he thinks, if he can establish that, he says, well, now we can have a clear, focused conversation. Is murder good? Is euthanasia good? Are they the same thing? Right? Like we can have all those conversations. Is this good or not? But good qua good, we just have to be oriented towards it. We just have to be considering it and we have to know it. But we know it in that experiential way, maybe. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but perhaps the only available way is knowing it like Adam knew his wife, rather than knowing it like here's a proposition that's well defined that I can affirm for good reasons or something like that. Okay. Let's move on. Ethics. It is just because I think that this, all right. I must try to explain the difference between these two. I suppose it may be granted that good is an adjective. Well, the good, that which is good, must therefore be the substantive to which the adjective good will apply. It must be the whole of that to which the adjective will apply, and the adjective must always truly apply to it. But if it is that to which, all right, so he also wants to focus on foundations here, right? So the good, meaning like the main principle we should care about. We can, if we're looking for something like that, it has to always be good. Good always applies to it, right? That kind of a thing. But if you just take away that principle and you're just talking about good qua good, he says you're not going to be able to define it. So let's see what that means for our foundations talk. All right, it must be the whole. So let's see that. Let's read that sentence again. The good, that which is good, must therefore be the substantive to which the adjective good will apply. It must be the whole of that to which the adjective will apply, and the adjective must always truly apply to it. So if you can come up with a pleasure is the good or something like that, which he's denying is possible, then pleasure must always be good, and there must be nothing that's good that isn't pleasure, right? They have to be equivalent, something like that. And I think he's going to deny that those are that those are reasonable. It's you're getting rid of the good if you do that. All right, so let's see. But if it is that to which the adjective will apply, it must be something different from that adjective itself. And the whole of that something different, whatever it is, will be our definition of the good. Now, it may be that this something will have other adjectives besides good that will apply to it. It may be full of pleasure, for example. It may be intelligent. And if these two adjectives are really part of its definition, then it will certainly be true that pleasure and intelligence are good. And many people appear to think that. If we say pleasure and intelligence are good, or if we say only pleasure and intelligence are good, we are defining good. Well, I cannot deny that propositions of this nature may sometimes be called definitions. I do not know well enough how the word is generally used to decide upon this point. I only wish it to be understood that that is not what I mean when I say there is no possible definition of good, and that I shall not mean this if I use the word again. I do most fully believe that some true proposition of the form intelligence is good and intelligence alone is good could be found. Okay, so I was wrong. He thinks you could have a statement like that. If none could be found, our definition of the good would be impossible. As it is, I believe the good to be definable, and yet I still say that good itself is indefinable. Okay, so I should have finished that paragraph because now it's clearer what he's saying. So he does think it's possible we could find a definition of the good, but not of good. Okay, so let's see. Good, then, if we mean by it that quality which we assert to belong to a thing, when we say that the thing is good, is incapable of any definition in the most important sense of that word. The most important sense of definition is that in which a definition states what are the parts which invariably compose a certain whole. And in this sense, good has no definition because it is simple and has no parts. It is one of those innumerable objects of thought which are themselves incapable of definition because they are the ultimate terms by reference to which whatever is capable of definition must be defined. That there must be an indefinite number of such terms is obvious on reflection, since we cannot define anything except by analysis, which, when carried as far as it will go, refers us to something which is simply different from anything else, and which, by that ultimate difference, explains the peculiarity of the whole with which we are dealing. For every whole contains some parts which are common and common to other wholes also. There is, therefore, no intrinsic quality in the contention that good denotes a simple and indefinable quality. There are many other instances of such qualities. All right, really quickly, just to paraphrase what he's saying there, simple enough. He's saying, look, we couldn't talk about anything if it weren't for the fact, like, I'm going to talk about a horse. Well, what's a horse? Well, let's see. Well, if we go with Webster, right, it's a four-legged creature of the genus Equa or equine. Okay, fine. What does that mean? Well, its genetic material has a code that is somewhere between here, and then these are intermediary species, and these are things that are not horses, something like that. Maybe we could, if we had all that data in front of us, sort of draw a line around. We'll call these things horses. It'd be a fuzzy line, and we could debate it forever. Okay, or we could say, well, it's a mammal. Okay, that gives us a lot of information. It's usually weighs between this and this, right? So let's try to nail down, is this thing a horse? Well, okay, what color is its skin? Does it have hair? Does it give birth to live children? Like we start trying to investigate. But as we take any of those qualities and we keep trying to justify it, we get more and more and more and more and more basic, right? Well, what do you mean it's brown? Well, brown is like this. Okay, we go down and down and down. Eventually he says the only way you could possibly distinguish the whole of the horse is by reference to these things that ultimately are basic, because there are other brown things, there are other four-legged things, there are other mammals, right? So what allows you to distinguish a thing like a horse from a sheep or a donkey even is the fact that you can look at those qualities until you can find the ones that they don't share and say, well, it has to have all of these. But those things have to, he says, by reflection, those things must be intrinsically different. Like at the basic level, those basic things have to be different, or else it wouldn't help us to distinguish between those things. So he says, I'm not making a fancy statement when I say the good is like a basic statement. I'm saying there's plenty, there's an indefinable, or what does he say here? He says, an indefinite number of such terms. Consider yellow, for example. We may try to define it by describing its physical equivalent. We may state what kind of light vibrations must stimulate the normal eye in order that we may perceive it. But a moment's reflection is sufficient to show that those light vibrations are not themselves what we mean by yellow. They are not what we perceive. Indeed, we should never be able to discover their existence unless we had first been struck by the patent difference of quality between the different colors. The most we can be entitled to say of those vibrations is that they are what corresponds in space to the yellow which we actually perceive, if that. Okay, we're going to pause. That's the first section. And then he has a second section that we'll read. This was great because we got to talk about a lot of other philosophical concepts that come up, the idea of simpleness and basicness, and his arguments. They're all rooted in a long tradition in Western philosophy, and he's using them quite well. Also, he brought up the synthetic analytic distinction, which we're going to do a whole section on something related that will bring it up an awful lot, which is the a priori. It's not the same distinction, but the a priori versus a posteriori distinction. We're going to do a whole section in this 101 course on stuff like that, so we'll have plenty of time to talk about it more. As to his original argument, where do you think it's going? What do you think it means? Do you think he's correct that good is a basic? I'll say basic. He's saying simple. He means the same thing, and there's clearly the philosophical concept of simplicity is in there for what he's saying. He's not misusing the word or anything like that. But there's a basicness, a groundedness. You can't get any deeper. Nature in the same way that yellow, the sensation of yellowness is basic, and you couldn't describe it in something other than just reference to it. About the concept of good. And remember, he's not saying you couldn't define the good. He's just saying good itself is something you just got to know at a basic level. I'm going to start secretly recording our pre-shows and our post-shows because you guys have lots of great stuff to say.
There certainly has to be some experience behind it. You would have to know what bad is to know what good is, right? You'd have to know what the opposite it is, or what lies in between, to really be able to understand it.
Yeah, it's like you couldn't tell a blind person what the sensation of seeing yellow is like, unless you can get that sensation. Maybe you can get that sensation by having a blow to your head or something, which we do have. I mean, you don't need the electromagnetic radiation. You could look at electromagnetic radiation for 10 billion years. You're never going to find what makes it yellow. There's no yellowness in certain wavelengths in that sense. But yellow is certainly a thing that we experience, and it's a part of our knowing of things. And so it's like, okay, well, I can't find, imagine if there were a group of scientists who said, we've discovered there's no such thing as yellow. You say, wow, really? That goes against my experience. What do you mean? Well, we've looked. I mean, we've just looked and looked and looked, and we know everything about what's going on when people report this illusion of theirs, this crazy delusion that they have, that there's a yellowness, but we've found nothing that's actually yellow. I mean, there's something subjective about perceiving the color of the litmus paper when you're doing the chemistry experiment. There's this is something I've been talking about in a different context, so maybe we won't go off on a tangent, but the objectivist perspective is actually unattainable ultimately, and that's okay. It doesn't mean science isn't valuable. Obviously, let's not go down that road. It's not relevant. But yeah, so he's saying good is like that. It's basic. It's like one of the ingredients of being that you just know or don't know. And it doesn't mean you're right about it, because we can have all the debates about defining, is this thing good? Is this thing always good? What's the good, in the sense that is this thing good that we're aiming at? Is it equivalent to this different concept that we also have? He says that's open for debate. That's all possible. But the only reason we can talk about all that stuff and what's the grounding for what makes things good, we can have all those conversations. I'm not saying that it's undefinable or indefinable in any of those ways. What I mean is, the only thing that makes possible those conversations is that you know what I'm talking about. And I couldn't tell you what I'm talking about if you didn't know what I was talking about. We all know what we're talking about. We could be very confused. We could be very wrong. We could have opposite definitions, but we know what it is we're trying to define, which he says we're never going to be able to define, because it's more like a basic unit of measurement than it is a thing you could wrap your mind around. It's what makes thinking possible, perhaps. It reminds me, again, all of these questions are intertwined with each other, and we're just barely not crashing through into the theological here. It's all relevant, but it's a lot like I think C.S. Lewis had this famous statement that people often probably misquote or quote too often, but it's a great quote. He says something like, I'm thinking of all the ways I've heard people misuse it. And I guess he said, I believe in God like I believe in the sun, not just because I see it, but because by it I see all things. Well, all right, let's put that quote aside. There is a distinction between being able to see because of something and being able to see the thing, right? And a better C.S. Lewis would be he wrote he wrote quite a lot of philosophical essays. He wrote one on blue specks, and I'll never remember the rest of the title. He made up two words, and his title was Blue Specks and something else. But in it, he talks about this idea of a beam of light coming through a barn door. So you're in a barn, picture yourself there. There's dust and powder and stacks of wood and all sorts. So you're in a barn, and there's this beam of light coming through the barn door. You can see the beam of light. You can measure its length and breadth and width, and you can see where it locates and what it's highlighting and spotlighting. And there's the beam of light. He says, sure, you can look at the beam of light that way, but you could also orient yourself so that the beam of light hit you right in the eye. And now you're looking at the same beam of light, but your experience is quite different from the outside the beam of light perspective. And he was talking about both perspectives being legitimate and necessary. What G.E. Moore is saying here is, I think good is the sort of thing we can talk about and define and see where it lands and what fits within it and what's outside of it. And we can do all of that, but there's no way to talk. This is important because he uses this phrase proposition, that propositions about the good are all of them synthetic and never analytic. What he means is, when we're talking about it to try to define it, we have to be outside it, looking at it that way to see what it does and what relates to it in that way. If you want to actually know it and it's hitting you in the eye, you've got nothing to say. There's nothing you can say about what that's like. You just have to not be blind and orient yourself so that it hits you, right? That would be the analogy if we borrow C.S. Lewis's analogy for what he's saying here. He's saying, if we're going to sit here and define that, it ain't going to work. You see it or you don't. It's an experience, like Savad was saying. It's really, there's an ingredient of what he's talking about that boils down to the experiential, or maybe the constitutional, right? Because there's a flip side to the coin. It's either you experience it or you have the capacity to experience it, right? Because there's this other idea, well, if I'm colorblind, I don't know what yellow is. So when you say you need the experience, you're right. And I think that's what he's talking about. And I think what you also mean is what he's really talking about, which is you have to have the capacity for the experience. There has to be something about you that's capable of seeing yellow for the word yellow to really mean to you what it means to us. If it doesn't, if you're an AI program with all of the use of words, and maybe if we plugged you into machines that could run experiments and you could collect all this new data, you could talk about yellow forever and wavelengths and reflective angles and all sorts of things, but you still don't know what the hell you're talking about unless you have a capacity to have the yellowness experience or something like that. So good. Awesome. Thank you. Let's do this. Let's push through here and see what he's going to build off of that. So his next section is called the naturalistic fallacy. Yet a mistake of this simple kind has commonly been made about good. It may be true that all things which are good are also something else, just as it is true that all things which are yellow produce a certain kind of vibration in the light, and it is a fact that ethics aims at discovering what are those other properties belonging to all things which are good. But far too many philosophers have thought that when they named those other properties, they were actually defining good, that these properties, in fact, were simply not other, but absolutely and entirely the same with goodness. This view I propose to call the naturalistic fallacy, and of it I shall now endeavor to dispose. Suppose a man says, "I am pleased," and suppose that is not a lie or a mistake, but the truth. Well, if it is true, what does that mean? It means that his mind, a certain definite mind, distinguished by certain definite marks from others, has at this moment a certain definite feeling called pleasure. Pleased means nothing but having pleasure. And though we may be more pleased or less pleased, and even, we may admit, for the present, have one or another kind of pleasure, yet, insofar as it is pleasure, we have, whether there be more or less of it, and whether it be of one kind or another, what we have is one definite thing, absolutely indefinable. Some one thing that is the same in all the various degrees and in all the various kinds of it that there may be. We may be able to say how it is related to other things, that, for example, it is in the mind, that it causes desire, that we are conscious of it, etc., etc. All sorts of things we could say about this basic state or sense. We can, I say, describe its relations to other things, but define it we cannot. And if anybody tried to define pleasure for us as being any other natural object, if anybody were to say, for instance, that pleasure means the sensation of red, and were to proceed to deduce from that that pleasure is a color, we should be entitled to laugh at him and to distrust his future statements about pleasure. Well, that would be the same fallacy, which I have called the naturalistic fallacy, that pleased does not mean having the sensation of red or anything else, whatever, does not prevent us from understanding what it does mean. It is enough for us to know that pleased does mean having the sensation of pleasure. And though pleasure is absolutely indefinable, though pleasure is pleasure and nothing else whatever, yet we feel no difficulty in saying that we are pleased. The reason is, of course, that when I say I am pleased, I do not mean that I am the same thing as having pleasure. And similarly, no difficulty need be found in my saying that pleasure is good, and yet not meaning that pleasure is the same thing as good, that pleasure means good, and that good means pleasure. If I were to imagine that when I said I am pleased, I meant that I was exactly the same thing as pleased, I should not indeed call that a naturalistic fallacy, although it would be the same fallacy as I have called naturalistic in reference to ethics. The reason for this is obvious enough. When a man confuses two natural objects with one another, defining the one by the other, if, for instance, he confuses himself, who is one natural object, with pleased or with pleasure, which are others, then there is no reason to call the fallacy naturalistic. But if he confuses good, which is not in the same sense a natural object, with any natural object whatever, then there is a reason for calling that a naturalistic fallacy. It's being made with regard to good marks it as something quite specific, and this specific mistake deserves a name because it is so common. As for the reasons why good is not to be considered a natural object, they may be reserved for discussion in another place. Okay, so if you're feeling like he needs to prove that, he says that'll come in a different essay, perhaps. We're going to focus on this. But for the present, it is sufficient to notice this. Even if it were a natural object, that would not alter the nature of the fallacy, nor diminish its importance one whit. All that I have said about it would remain quite equally true. Only the name which I have called it would not be so appropriate as I think it is. And I do not care about the name. What I do care about is the fallacy. It does not matter what we call it, provided we recognize it when we meet with it. It is to be met with in almost every book on ethics, and yet it is not recognized. And that is why it is necessary to multiply illustrations of it and convenient to give it a name. It is a very simple fallacy indeed. When we say that an orange is yellow, we do not think that our statement binds us to hold that orange means nothing else than yellow, or that nothing can be yellow but an orange. Supposing the orange is also sweet, does that bind us to say that sweet is exactly the same as yellow, that sweet must be defined as yellow? And supposing it be recognized that yellow just means yellow and nothing else whatever, does that make it any more difficult to hold that oranges are yellow? Most certainly it does not. On the contrary, it would be absolutely meaningless to say, all right, so before we go on, really quickly, his side note is kind of interesting here. I want to get into this yellow and orange thing, but his side note here is interesting. He's telling us why he's called this a naturalistic fallacy. And then he's saying, but forget the name because maybe I'm wrong about that and I'm not going to argue for it or whatever. We need a name for it. And then he says, the reason we need a name for it is because every book on ethics, almost every book on ethics, makes this elementary mistake that I've identified, and I'm pointing it out. We need to notice it, see examples of it so that we don't make it. When we're talking about the good, that's great. Let's talk about the good. But when we think we've defined good, we're making a mistake. And we think we've defined good when we talk about the good. We talk about something being good, right? So, or actually, let's just stick with the good. That's the bigger example. So when somebody says pleasure is good, or pleasure and intelligence are good, or something like that, when they say it's the good, they think they're grasping good and saying this is what good is. What he's saying is no. What you're saying is an orange is yellow, like the piece of fruit, or a banana. Let's say banana since orange is another color. The banana is yellow. That's all you're saying. That's super helpful. That's great. Let's try to do that. But why do you think you've grasped yellowness if you're correct that bananas are yellow, right? He's saying yellow is basic. Yellow is simple. Yellow is something you're not going to ever have a definition for, but you think you do. But he's saying you're really making as silly a mistake as saying banana means yellow. When you say something like the greatest happiness is the good. The greatest happiness could easily be good, just like a banana can be yellow. A banana is also sweet and it's good for sustaining life. It's all sorts of things, right? But it's a banana. It's a specific thing, right? You're saying pleasure or happiness or utility or whatever it is you're saying is the good. That's the banana. Okay, let's do that. That would be a great conversation to have. But you need to recognize that it's not good qua good, because that's a thing that you already know or don't know on the basic level that you know yellow. And then he calls it the naturalistic fallacy because he thinks that good is not a natural thing. It's not an object, but utility, collections of objects, things like that. So he's sort of hinting at the idea that good might be outside the world and infused in it, or supernatural or something like that. Supernatural, clearly, because he's calling it the naturalistic fallacy. But then he says, look, I don't have time to argue that that's the case. And maybe I'm wrong about that. Who cares? The reason I'm calling it the naturalistic fallacy is because I think that's true. But whatever, we can settle that on another day. We need a name for this fallacy because we're doing it all the time. And we need to identify when we're doing it because it's messing up our notions. And this whole conversation is getting confusing because we're not noticing that we're doing something this simple. So let's try to keep that in mind, that he's looking for these ultimate definitions of the good. And he's saying, okay, those are very useful. Are you making a mistake when you say you've defined good in that way? The good, maybe, but don't think you've defined good. Don't think you've figured out what good is. Good is like saying, I am pleased. That can be true or not true. Fine. But pleasure, the sensation of pleasure, it doesn't rely on anything else for definition. You just know that that's a basic concept. Now, that might be natural. So he wouldn't call that the naturalistic fallacy. He's reserving that for this thing because he thinks good is supernatural, obviously. But in any case, it's the same logical fallacy, he says, that we're making all the time in our ethics books. So let's see if that's convincing to us. Once again, suppose the orange is also sweet. Does that bind us to say that sweet is exactly the same thing as yellow, that sweet must be defined as yellow? And supposing that we recognize that yellow just means yellow and nothing else whatsoever, does that make it any more difficult for us to notice that oranges are yellow, right? It could be true that utility is the good or something like that. You can still say that. It's not a problem. It's just, it's not yellow qua yellow or good qua good. Most certainly it does not. On the contrary, it would be absolutely meaningless to say that oranges were yellow unless yellow did in the end mean just yellow and nothing else whatever, unless it was absolutely indefinable. If it wasn't the case that yellow was indefinable, all of our conversations are just babbly nonsense. But we can make progress in our conversations because we have access, he's saying, to these basic notions. We should not get any very clear notion about things which are yellow. We should not get very far with our science if we were bound to hold that everything which was yellow meant exactly the same thing as yellow. We should find we had to hold that an orange was exactly the same thing as a stool, a piece of paper, a lemon, anything you like. We could prove any number of absurdities, but should we be the nearer to the truth? Why then should it be different with good? Okay, so this is interesting because sometimes in philosophy, people say, well, you're just staring into your belly button. And how important is this point that he's making? Well, it should be noted that he's not wrong when he thinks that people all the time are saying the exact opposite of what he's saying here. This isn't just some weird, oh, I found a mistake we were making. Okay, maybe. No, there are people who say what yellow means is all the things that are yellow. It's an empiricist type of a position, right? So we said you have to have the experience to know if you know the thing, perhaps, maybe, maybe not. But the sum of the experiences isn't equivalent. Okay. If we said, I'm an infinite being and I travel the universe for all of eternity and I have every experience possible of everything that's yellow and everything that's not yellow. And when I say yellow, I mean this subsection of things or events or experiences. That's not yellow. He says, if I were to try to think that that was good enough, ultimately all of my conversation and ideas would be completely confused. There's nothing, there's no way that the word means anything if its meaning has to come from just that. It has to actually have meaning or there's no basic units of meaning. He could be right about that, right? So we say, well, that obviously that's not the problem because we sometimes think that's the case and our conversation makes sense. He's saying, yeah, because you're relying on basic notions and you're just not noticing that that's what you're doing, perhaps. But there certainly are people who think like yellow doesn't mean anything more than the set of experiences that are yellowy or the types of objects that could trigger such an experience when seen or something like that. Socrates, this might not be clear how important this point is. Socrates made this point in a very confusing part of a passage once that we have already read and maybe skipped over. Here's a good way of illustrating it. Is this a good way of illustrating it? Yeah. we take for granted the basicness of these notions. If I had a chalkboard here and I drew a 4, and then I drew another 4, and I drew a 3, and I said which numbers are the same, you would say the two 4s are the same, obviously. But if you just look at those two 4s, they're very different. They're completely different. There's maybe nothing that's exactly the same about them, right? I mean, we know that they're the same as they're symbolically pointing at this shape that we're recognizing and whatever, which is just pointing at another notion, right? So it's a symbol to a symbol, maybe 3 times through. But the squiggles are not the same. They're not in the same location. They're, if you zoomed in, there's nothing about the lines that looks the same. They're completely different. How is it that we even have the ability to recognize that they're the same? Socrates says, because we have a basic notion of sameness. We have a basic notion of, there's actually, I know Elaine is probably bursting here because there's a lot here that is very Platonic in his approach and that is pointing at forms. But that's the argument he's making here. And it's, he says we would be very confused if we take for granted that we're not confused when we talk about things being yellow, but we wouldn't really have a notion. Ultimately, in the swirl of all the things we can say and experience, yellow would lose its meaning entirely if all it was something you could figure out without something we're bringing to the table. I don't think he wants to make that point, but I think that's the case, right? So the basic understanding of it is something that has to be relied upon for the conversation to make sense. And some people don't want to see that, so they deny it, but they still have to rely upon it in order to have their conversations to deny it. Am I being clear here? Can somebody please challenge me? Because I can make it more clear if only people will say, what the hell are you talking about? I'm sitting here like, am I making it too clear and you're all bored? Have I totally lost everybody? It sound like I'm babbling? I need some feedback to know. I got no facial expressions. So, all right, well, I'll just say if challenged, we can pursue that and it will be more clear. All right. We should not get very clear notions about things which are yellow. We should not get very far in our science if we were bound to hold that everything which was yellow meant exactly the same thing as yellow. We should find we had to hold an orange was exactly the same thing as a stool and a piece of paper, a lemon, or anything you like. We could prove any number of absurdities, but should we be any nearer to the truth? Why then should it be different with good? Why, if good is good and indefinable, should we be held to deny that pleasure is good? Is there any difficulty in holding both to be true at once? On the contrary, there is no meaning in saying that pleasure is good unless good is something different from pleasure. It is absolutely useless, so far as ethics is concerned, to prove, as Mr. Spencer tries to do, that increase of pleasure coincides with increase of life, unless good means something different from either life or pleasure. We might just as well try to prove that an orange is yellow by showing that it always is wrapped up in paper. In fact, if it is not the case that good denotes something simple and indefinable, only two alternatives are possible. Either it is a complex, a given whole, about the correct analysis of which there may be disagreement, or else it means nothing at all, and there is no such subject as ethics. In general, however, ethical philosophers have attempted to define good without recognizing what such an attempt must mean. So this is interesting. He's saying all of these ethics books, so often we're making this mistake of trying to define good, but good is basic. We need to start with good, like we have to start with yellow, purple, or blue, or red. I'm trying to find colors of litmus paper, right? You can do a lot with sensing those colors, but you have to just sort of understand color in order to refer to it, right? You can talk about things being color, you can describe it all day long, the types of events that would trigger a color sensation, but you just have to know color in some sense. So same with good. And that doesn't stop you from doing all those sciences of optics and psychology and maybe spectral generating machines inside of the neurological frameworks of the mind or whatever the heck it is you want to discover in your neuroscience or your psychology or your optics or your physics or anything. You can do all of those things because yellowness is basic. You can have ethics as a conversation because the good is something that is indefinable in the exact same way. And he says, notice all these ethical philosophers who are trying to define the good, not the good, because he wants to say that means like the orange is yellow and that's acceptable to him, but to define good by saying it doesn't mean anything different than this thing, and I've really wrapped my mind around the words perfectly, this is good, this is what good means. He says the consequences of that are either you're wrong because good means nothing, or that good is a complex, and in either case the subject of ethics doesn't exist, I think. Let's see if he says that follows from the first one. Either it is a complex, a given whole about the correct analysis of which there may be disagreement, or else it means nothing at all, and there is no such subject as ethics. In general, however, ethical philosophers have attempted to find good without recognizing what such an attempt must mean. So it's funny because to aim at the good, to aim at the summum bonum, the ultimate principle, or the thing, as Socrates would say, the thing to relate to, the ultimate source of all good, good qua good, is if you discover that good could be defined in this way, then good is a complex, and you should actually be aiming at whatever it is that's making up good, the different parts, and find out which of them is important, or what multiples of them are fundamentally important. The fact that the good is just fundamentally important is important to a, a large number of the most important ethically concerned people. And the only alternative to that is that good means nothing, and then therefore there's no subject of ethics. So he's saying this is a big mistake. It's simple. He also keeps saying that it takes a moment of reflection to see that this is a mistake. You don't have to look at, he's not saying because of the consequences it's a mistake. He's not saying, oh, I want ethics, so therefore we must think this or else we'll have no ethics. He's saying, look, this is as obviously retarded as saying banana is the orange or the yellow or something like that. It's like, we can have conversations about what is yellow and what is the yellow and what defines yellow in the sense that it's always yellow or whatever. But the only reason those mean anything is that yellow is something different than those things. You haven't encapsulated the good when you say pleasure or life promotion or utility or any of those other things is good. That's not good. It's maybe the good or a part of the good or a consequence of being good. All of those are great conversations, but they're only made possible because good is qualitatively, basically different from the thing you're saying that this is like that, or it participates in that, or it's inevitably going to always be that or something. It's what's the that has to be a different thing in order for any of those conversations to make sense and for the subject to make sense, which he obviously thinks it does. Okay. It is very natural to make the mistakes of supposing that what is universally true is of such a nature that its negation would be self-contradictory. The importance which has been assigned to analytic propositions in the history of philosophy shows how easy such a mistake is. And thus, it is very easy to conclude that what seems to be a universal ethical principle is in fact an identical proposition. That if, for example, whatever is called good seems to be pleasant, the proposition pleasure is the good does not assert a connection between two different notions, but involves only one, that of pleasure, which is easily recognized as a distinct entity. But whoever will attentively consider with himself what is actually before his mind when he asks the question, is pleasure, or whatever else it may be, after all good, can easily satisfy himself that he is not merely wondering whether pleasure is pleasant, And if he will try this experiment with each suggested definition in succession, he may become expert enough to recognize that in every case he has before his mind a unique object with regard to the connection of which with any other object a distinct question may be asked. Everyone does, in fact, understand the question, is this good? When he thinks of it, his state of mind is different from what it would be if he were to ask, is this pleasant or desired or approved? It has a distinct meaning for him, even though he may not recognize in what respect it is distinct. Whenever he thinks, all right, so before we finish this, it's getting quite good as he's wrapping it up. Let's focus on this point here. He's saying, look, if I'm wrong about this, if you really can say good means pleasure, pleasure means good, if you can do that, or if you are doing that and you want to see that it's a mistake, and then he's giving us a tool. So every time we're reading any ethical foundations or summum bonum conversation to define good, he says, do this experiment. Say to yourself, is pleasure really good? Like, is it? And then say, when I ask myself that question, am I saying, is pleasure really pleasurable? No, that's axiomatically the case. And that's also not what was in my mind when I asked the first question, is pleasure really good? Right? Hey, Norm. Hey, wake up. He's having a doggy dream. Okay. So that's all you have to do. If you want to see if you're making this mistake, just say to yourself, okay, somebody defined for me, good is that which is beneficial. Okay. And then I ask myself, is that which is beneficial really equivalent to the good? I'm asking myself a question. I know what's at stake. I know what the question means. He doesn't say you have to have the answer to the question. I know what the question means. Okay, now that you're clear about the question, is the question in your head, is that which is beneficial really that which is beneficial? No, that's not what I'm thinking about. I'm trying to figure out if that which is beneficial really is the good. Oh, okay. So it's clear to you now that good means something else. And he says that's going to happen every time you have one of these because it's a basic notion in your mind. That's how you can check yourself and say, oh, I'm making that thing that he was saying was called the naturalistic fallacy. Oh, I'm making the naturalistic fallacy again. Oh, I'm doing the naturalistic fallacy. I'm forgetting that goodness is a basic concept like yellowness, right? It's just not something you define in other terms. It's just basic. It's simple. It's a part of what I need to make these conversations possible and meaningful. He said, we're making this mistake all the time when we try to define good as any of these other things. And he says it takes a moment of reflection to realize we're making a logical error. And since it's so easy to make this error, here's a nice little thought tool for you. Every time you think you've got a definition of good, good means, let's say good means, we can't use that one because he does that. We'll just stick with the utilitarians because they're the ones inclined to, okay. There's a large section. The utilitarians are right at the heart of it. All right. So good means that which promotes life. If somebody wanted to define good, say all the things that are bad are things that are bad for life, and all the things that we decided are things that are good for life. So the good is life promotion. And you say, okay, I wonder if that's true. Life promotion equals goodness. Is life promotion what I mean by good? Is it really the definition of good? Okay, what's in my mind right now? Is life promotion really that which is promoting life? No. I'm saying, is it good? There's another concept here. That other concept is not just equivalent to this other thing. The only reason the conversation would be meaningful, possible, and important and doable is because there's this other basic thing. So stop trying to define good. Good is indefinable. It's basic and necessary. Now let's go have all the conversations about what's the ultimate good? What's the summum bonum? What's the foundation of goodness? Is this thing good? We can do all of that because we're not making the first mistake of thinking that we could define good as something other than what it is. It's basic. It's simple. You can't do that. It has a distinct meaning for him, even though he may not recognize in what respect it is distinct, or even that it's distinct, because he says people are making this mistake all the time. Whenever he thinks of intrinsic value or intrinsic worth, or says that a thing ought to exist. He has before his mind a unique object, the unique property of things, which I mean by good. Everybody is constantly aware of this notion, although he may never become aware of at all that it is different from other notions of which he is also aware. But for correct ethical reasoning, it is extremely important that he should become aware of this fact. And as soon as the nature of the problem is clearly understood, there should be little difficulty in advancing so far in analysis. Good, then, is indefinable. And yet, so far as I know, there is only one ethical writer, Professor Henry Sedgwick, who has clearly recognized and stated this fact. Well, we know Alfred Lord Whitehead's Everything is a Series of Footnotes to Plato and Western Philosophy, and because we started all of this with a dive into the Socratic dialogues, we know that that's not the only person who's pointed this out. So, in any case, in our contemporary state of confusion on this topic, he's noticed only one other writer who has noticed this fact, but he thinks he's demonstrated it here and pointed it out. I have to say his arguments, there's a lot more to say and to attack of his position and for him to defend, but he's quite convincing. And, you know, I mean, I suspect he's correct, by the way, but I think he did a pretty good job. So what does everybody think? There are lots of ethicists, whole shelves of libraries, reams of paper written about the good is defined as this. This is what good is. I've identified it. It's this thing. A lot of different types of utilitarians. We could pull up our list of all these different camps that we had before in our slides on the intro. It's probably this one. Okay, let's go take a look here. Oh, let's go back. All right. So remember, the summum bonum could be the big principle or it could be the real good qua good. But in either case, these consequentialists, I think maybe he would say every one of them is making this mistake. And maybe that's unfair, by the way, to them. But we could certainly, it's easy to do with the consequentialists. So maybe it is unfair to them. But what we could easily do with the consequentialists is we could say there's a straightforward way of reading what they're saying and of easily misunderstanding them or maybe getting them right, where they're making this thing that he's calling the naturalistic fallacy, which maybe we could come up with another word for it since he didn't take any time to defend the naturalistic part. But he's certainly defended why it needs a name. It says they're making this mistake of thinking, I can define good in terms other than the thing itself. You can't define the sensation of yellowness in terms other than itself. It's just basic. You can certainly have a lot to say about it. After that, you can decide if something is yellow or isn't yellow. You can decide, just like with pleasure, you can decide if something creates pleasure, if you're mistaken that you're having a pleasurable experience. You can have all sorts of conversations about it because it's a basic concept, because it's not something that you should look for it to be an object. So what's interesting in this subjective versus objective argument about ethics is the subjectivists are attacking the objectivists, and he's saying you're all making a mistake. The reason why you shouldn't be worried about any of the arguments against any of this is that this is a basic concept. It's something that isn't objective, but that's not a bad thing. It's basic. It's more real than objective. That might be one of the effects of what he's contributing to the battlefield, perhaps. What he's trying to accomplish, maybe even. So, I know we're going to have a great conversation once I turn this off. Does anybody want to say anything? Just questions, clarity. You think he's full of nonsense? I mean, anything. Okay, to those of you who are listening on the live streams, you're going to miss out on the after show where we're all going to start talking and have a great time. Oh, Sivad, you unmuted.
Yeah. When we go back to when he's talking about good and pleasure, I'm looking for the. Here we go. He says, whatever is called good seems to be pleasant. The proposition pleasure is the good does not assert a connection between two different notions, but involves only one, that of pleasure, which is easily recognized as a distinct entity. And yeah, I would suppose, I mean, not all. I guess what comes to mind is
Sure.
right, you're lighting a cigarette. It tastes good. There's this sensation of the nicotine hitting the bloodstream. And then it's like, right, is that good overall? Like it's a pleasurable feeling in the moment, and that's good short term. But then I would have to agree. I mean, it is, even though it seems quite simple, I think that's just ingrained in us. And it certainly is, it can be quite more complex of good, because then, right, it not only applies to taste and smell and feeling and seeing something or witnessing something that is, that is good. It was on 327.
Yeah, I remember it because I remember the way he wrote it was a little confusing, but that's not the nature of your question, so that's good. I found it here. So, yeah, I think it's important to stress that he's saying all of these debates and these conversations are only possible when we they're only possible because it's true that good is a basic concept. He says, I'm not making up some magical idea. There's plenty of basic concepts. Pleasure is a basic concept.
Mm-hmm.
Yellowness is a basic concept. He's calling it simple. Let's stick with simple. But he's saying, so it's not some magical category that only good falls into. It's just that it's basic, it's simple. And the only reason we can have all of these debates about the complexities, do all things that are pleasurable fall into the category of things that are good? He says we could debate that. Maybe that's true, right? If it was true, we could have all sorts of utilitarian formulas for deciding if something is good or not. All of that's still available to us. Maybe we would decide it's false. Obviously, there's some things that are pleasant for one reason or another that aren't good, we might say, and we might argue that. He says the only reason that we can have that argument is that what Mill is doing, or what somebody is doing if they're trying to say that all pleasure is always good, is not making an equivalence between the two. Because if it was an equivalence between the two, we wouldn't have, the ethical discussion would be done, and also everything we're saying would be nonsensical. It would be like, let's debate for an hour about whether or not that which is pleasurable is actually pleasurable. Like, okay, that might be interesting, but that's a different question. That's not the question we were trying to answer, and we're not in ethics anymore. But he says, what we mean when we ask the question is something that is pleasurable good, because you don't know how to define it because it's indefinable, but you know what we're talking about. Right? You can't tell me what we're talking about, but we all know what we're talking about. And he says, well, that's okay. That happens all the time. It's what makes conversations possible in all these other fields. Everything's reduced to something basic. Ultimately, he said, examine the horse. Tell me what a horse is. If I keep asking the 2-year-old question, why, or what do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean? You're going to get to basic concepts. And either the child knows what brown is or he doesn't. But you're not going to be able to define the composite horse in the face of that type of questioning until you eventually get down to basic things. And the only reason he says this is important philosophically, that the conversation does work, is that those basic things are different from one another. They can't be equivalent to each other, or else the conversation wouldn't be possible. So he says it just takes a moment of reflection, he thinks, on that, to realize that we need basic concepts and we use them all the time. And they're the only reason any of our conversation is possible at all. And he says, for some reason in the field of ethics, we forget that more often than in any other field. And so he's going to call it the naturalistic fallacy for reasons he doesn't justify, but hints at. But he says we need a name for this fallacy because this is screwing up and making us wonder if we're even talking about anything at all. You can't justify it. Define it for me. Define it for me. Define it for me. He says that's an illegitimate question. Right? Imagine we're trying to have an ethics conversation. We say, well, we're trying to find out what the good is so that we can live according to it or have a good life or something. And somebody comes in and says, what do you mean by good? What do you mean by good? What do you mean by good? It's like, I mean something indefinable. I'm not going to define it. If I were to define it for you, we wouldn't be talking about it anymore. It's not that kind of a thing. And if somebody says, well, then you're not having a conversation at all. It's like, no, I'm only able to have the conversation because we're talking about something ultimately indefinable, which is how we have all of our conversations. And, it's funny because the scientismists would not like this argument, and they might not know why they don't like this argument. But what they wouldn't like about this argument deep inside is the fact that what he's saying is your science requires all of this too. To define a horse, to look at a litmus paper and notice the color of it means you have to appeal to things that are basic, that are just in the Constitution or in the capacity. It could be similar to the deontological. I mean, so one of the reasons I didn't use deontological examples when I was trying to illustrate the fallacy that he says we're making is that often the deontologists are acknowledging this. And so when they try to come up with rules about the good or living in accordance with the good, they're very much removed from actually defining it as something. But the consequentialists, the utilitarians, it's easier to pick on them for making this mistake because when you read them, you can often think, we discovered what the good is. It's to promote life or it's to increase happiness or something. It's like, okay, when you do that, it just takes a moment for you to realize that you're making a logical mistake. If increasing happiness is what the good is, if happiness is good and good is happiness and they don't have any other distinct meaning, we don't need the term anymore and the whole conversation's over. But that's not how you're even using it. Is that which increases happiness really good? When you ask that, do you mean, is that which increases happiness really increasing happiness? That's not what you mean. You know what you mean. You mean something other than that which increases happiness. You're trying to show that the banana is yellow. That's a great conversation to have. And you could be right that which increases happiness is always good. He's not saying you're wrong or anything. He's saying don't make the mistake of thinking they're equivalent, which it often seems like they're doing. And I think he might be quite right about that. He says, no, what you really need to have is the insight that realizes good is basic. Thank God it's real. Thank God we can care about it, but you're not going to build it up out of other things and define it. It's indefinable. But it's also important to notice that he's not abolishing any of those other conversations. He's actually grounding it. He's saying that they're all reasonable, right? Everything he said could be completely in agreement with the idea that Mill had ethics figured out perfectly, right? As long as he isn't making this mistake, it's possible that increasing the greatest good for the greatest number is always the good, and you can't get a better grasp around what would normally fit into the category of the good. I mean, he could be right, but we can have the conversation because what he's not doing, and if he thinks he's doing it, it's illegitimate and wrong. What he's not doing is giving us a definition of good. He's not showing us what it really means, and it's equivalent to this other thing. Basic terms are not equivalent to anything else. That's why they're basic. But because they're basic and different, it makes the distinctions of the composite things and all of those other conversations possible. What's nice about this meta-ethical essay in the context of the meta-ethical essays we're going to have on subjectivism and objectivism and the nature of these statements and what we mean by good and all of that is that I think a lot of people have the instinct that there's something confused about the debate to begin with, and he's pointing out something that he thinks is a confusion, and if he's right, it clarifies an awful lot. right? If we were to sit down to do ethics now, saying, okay, the one thing we've all agreed on is that this fallacy is made all the time and we don't want to make it because it's wrong. It's an illegitimate intellectual move. It's a mistake. It's a fallacy. Moore was correct. Let's not do that. Well, okay, why? What's the alternative? Well, we agree. It's basic. Good is a thing that we can be concerned with. We don't have to define it. That's what we're concerned with. Well, now we can start having the ethical conversation. It's almost as if he's taken away and he's clarified the debate that's happening. He said, you don't have to have that debate. The nature of the conversation we're having isn't the sort of thing where those challenges even mean anything or the defense is against them, right? He says, look at all these ethicists who say, I can define the good. He goes, well, you just destroyed ethics. Thanks a lot. Right. And all of the critics that are saying, define it for me, define it for me. He says, my response is, hell no, there's no way to. Now let's have the conversation. There's no way to. If you could, it would destroy the conversation. But because we can have the conversation, because you know what we're talking about, you're not blind. If we wanted to talk about what is yellow, I can't tell you what yellowness is and the experience of feeling and seeing yellow. But if you have it and you know what we're talking about, now we can have all these conversations about which electromagnetic radiation wavelengths trigger a yellow experience and which objects reflect yellow light, if we want to talk in those terms. We can have all those conversations because you know what I mean by yellow, not that you've got a definition of it, but that you know what we're talking about. So there's no challenge anymore in the define for me what we're talking about first. No. I refuse, says Moore. I refuse because, one, it's not that kind of thing. It couldn't be done. And two, thank God it couldn't be done, because if it could be done, we couldn't have this conversation, right? So it's almost like the challenge is so illegitimate because it's saying, do this before we can have the conversation. He's saying, if I did that, we would never be able to have the conversation because we'd have to change the subject. But all you have to do, if you want to agree with him that there is a subject to talk about, is say to yourself, whatever it is I want, what do I want for a definition? X means good. The good or goodness is always X, and X is always goodness. Okay. Why did you want that? Where does that get you? Well, could it be wrong? Ask yourself, could you be wrong? Well, is X really good? Is that really the definition of good? Is X? Well, are you saying is X really the definition of X? No. I want to know if it's the definition of good. He goes, aha, that's what we're talking about. Something different from X. That's the whole freaking point, is that your attempt to get something that's equivalent to it, it would be to demolish it. Don't make that mistake. Let's just go talk about ethics now, because good is like yellow. It's basic. It's kind of a fun essay. I don't know. How about, go ahead.
I think it's fun to explore some of these, I don't know, basic notions we have that we may take for granted, or may not take for granted, just not highlight the complexity in something so basic, right? Because he's saying we can't even have this conversation because we'd have to have a total different conversation to define what is good. And if we can't even agree on what is good or what we view as being good, then it may not even be worthwhile having that next conversation.
So weird. His argument is so weird. All right. This is so bizarre because everything you just said is true, of course, right? If we couldn't agree on a definition, it's like, well, where are we? Well, that's what philosophers want to do. Let's just dive into disagreement after disagreement after disagreement. Who knows what we'll discover if we do that? That's all fine. He's saying something even weirder than that. What he's saying is, You're wrong to want a definition of good. I don't want us all to be in agreement that X is equivalent to good and good is equivalent to X. We can argue all day about whether or not things that are pleasant are always good or participate in goodness. We can have those debates. But if you're looking for what I mean by good is X, that's going to change the conversation because we won't be talking about goodness anymore. We'll be talking about Xness. We can talk about whether or not things are pleasurable. But if you think that pleasure is equivalent to good, we've left the field of ethics now. We're
right, but there'd still be a way to classify these things, right? It's like
you can classify anything that's composite. You can't classify. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
When he's saying you can't define it, we were talking about that, but it's like, yes, but that is an example of good, right? That's in the classification of good. Maybe
exactly.
There's these 15 things that we can say are good that aren't good, but those represent good in the nature of good.
100%. It's very important to understand what you just illustrated there, because if we misunderstand him to say that you can't do that, he's also saying we can't have the conversation about foundations and the nature of good. He says, no, he said, there's 3 ways you could define good that I completely agree with. You could say, here's what I mean by the word. Here's how the word is generally used. And you can even do what Savad just pointed out. You can say pleasure is always good, right? You could talk about the good in the sense that this is a quality of the good. You can even do that. He says that's legitimate, right? So it's important to know that he's not making the argument that you can't do that. You can totally have that conversation, and that's great. But the reason you can have that conversation is that good is itself distinct from pleasure. It's not equivalent to pleasure, even if it's true that all pleasurable things are always good, or that the good will always be attenuated with a certain type of pleasure or something like that. Even if that's the case, the good is a different concept from the pleasurable.
Right, but it's more that it's distinct from bad than pleasurable. I think I understand what he's saying, good and pleasurable, but it's good because it's distinct from the bad, from what the opposite of it is.
He's saying it's distinct from everything. It's its own distinct thing.
Sure.
You see what I mean? Right? So
right.
It's not equivalent to pleasure. To him, it could be, by the way.
Right.
We can have that discussion. But for him, it couldn't be equivalent to pleasure, not because there's a problem with pleasure, but because it's not the sort of thing that can be equivalent to anything.
Mark, did you want to say something?
I was going to ask Stephen to restate what he said about defining something that's a composite, but I would agree that basic definitions such as good have to be a composite. They basically, this number of things falls under this category. Such and such things are good, are examples of goodness. Categorization and basically hierarchy of definitions.
Good. Okay. So let's focus on the terminology a minute so that we're sure we're using it correctly. Very good, by the way. Composite things can be basic. They can have the basic qualities to them, right? A horse can be brown and a mammal. A horse can be, well, let's say mammal's a composite concept too, right? Horses can be hairy. Horses can be, we can understand the composite thing is the horse. But the things that define the horse are its participation with basic things in a group that are different than the group that would apply to donkeys, right? So all of the basic concepts that apply to donkeys is how we can distinguish donkeys from horses. Ultimately, the way you get a definition of a donkey or a horse, those are composites, is by referring to things that are not composites. So the good is not composite, but a good thing is composite, right? So the difference between a simple and a composite thing, or a complex is how he calls it. I keep saying basic and complicated, right? Let's use his terminology. A complex versus a simple. That's the terminology he's using. And he's using well-established philosophical concepts. And he's not going out of his way to give us definitions of them, because he's assuming that we're familiar with them, which we are, and are going to be more familiar with them the more we do. But what he's saying is a complex is a composite. It's a thing that's made up. It's got a left and a right. It's got different sides. It's made up of multiple organs, whatever. It's complicated. A complex is only distinguishable from another complex because it participates in having some of the same, but not all of the same relationship to simple concepts. To the simple things. Instead of saying basic, but basic conceptualizations. So I own 2 horses, and one is red and one is brown. Great. Now you can tell which horse I'm talking about, the red horse or the brown horse. That's how I can distinguish between 2 complex things, is by showing that all of the simple things that apply to this one are not the same as the category of simple things that apply to this one. Isn't that clever, right? He's noticing, or he thinks he's identifying correctly, and I think he might be right about this. Elena must be having a fit right now, because this is very Socratic. A positive fit, not a negative one. But this idea, this realization that he thinks only belongs to him and one other person about the good, is something Socrates was really hammering about a lot, which is that you have conversations where you try to get to the truth about this and that and this and that, and all of those things are rooted in something more fundamental. And the only reason those conversations make sense and we can make any progress on them at all is that they are rooted in things that are basic, simple, more fundamental. And the way you can even distinguish between 2 things is whether or not the same category of simples apply to it as the category of simples that apply to the other thing. If all of the same apply in all the same ways, you're only talking about one thing. The only way to talk about 2 different things is to find a distinction amongst the simples that participate with it. Now, we're not used to talking this way, but we should get used to talking this way, right? Let's just adopt the language for now and the concepts for now as we're approaching it. So complexes are composites. They're things that are made up of parts and sides, and there's a lot you can say about them, and there's a lot of science to do about them, and there's a lot to figure out about them. Every successful advance in understanding those things has to be rooted in things that you can't define, things that are just fundamental, and let's call them givens or axiomatic or something like that. Is that clear? Is it clearer?
Clearer.
Should we keep
yes.
pushing on it?
Clearer. Yep.
All right.
Just leaves me with one question.
Yeah, please.
Are horses good?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. But they're not good as equivalent to good. I know we're just joking around, but right. Hoarseness is not the same as goodness in the way that we mean it. But hoarseness could be a basic concept, possibly. But a horse is complicated, and yeah, this conversation is very clarifying, and I wish it wasn't so confusing to us, because the only reason it is that we don't think so clearly, including most of philosophy. This would probably be a good way for us to practice thinking. And it's a weird self-reflective realization about the way thoughts are working, that maybe we should just teach it in kindergarten so that we start thinking in that way all the time. Even if it's wrong, we should be able to understand the way these people are thinking when they're thinking like this, because it is quite clarifying. I feel like Elena can't be missing how Socratic this is and how closely it's pointing at the forms and everything at this point. Yes? Did you want to give us a burst of? I mean, it's certainly, Socrates makes the exact same argument. He really does, and we could look that up again, but we'll be spending a lot of time with him in year 2 and 3, as we did before. But This is a weird idea. The reason why this is weird and confusing is that we just don't pay enough attention to this idea. But it's not weird in the sense that it doesn't make sense. It's just, it's not the way we're used to thinking about our thinking. It's not clear to me why it would be wrong, though. So here would be an example of someone trying to push back on this notion. A radical empiricist might say, everything I have an idea of comes from my experience. And so what I'm doing is I'm abstracting, I'm collecting, I'm saying all of my yellow experiences were like this. And so I'm going to put them in a category called yellowness. And then when you ask me to define yellow, I can't really give you a definition, but that's not because it's basic. It's because it's abstract. It's a collection of this set of experiences all participate in yellow. The banana was yellow. The traffic light had a yellow, the paint on the road was yellow. The sun is yellow. These are my yellow experiences. But the notion of yellow doesn't come first. It's not more fundamental. It's just an abstraction that I've taken from all these things that happen to be yellow. And I put them in the category of experiences, including yellowness, and experiences that were devoid of yellowness. And I've got those categories. And I get to yellow. Socrates says you will never get to yellow that way. Never, ever, ever. The way you were able to put things in that category is that you had the basic notion. You can't get the basic notion by categorizing, because you could have just categorized differently. And you didn't talk it out with other people to decide, let's just put a sticky note on this and a sticky note on that and a sticky note on that. Those ones are the ones we'll call yellow. Okay, we all agree. There's our category. What do you mean by yellow? Oh, this category of yellow things. How did you get there? Well, we decided these things would be called yellowish. No, you'll never know which ones belong and which ones don't unless you have a basic knowledge of what it is that would put them in the category to begin with. And that idea and that argument, we never really come across it. But I think it's much more, it's the type of idea that I think could be so powerfully true that we should have been thinking about it all along. I'll try to come up with another example that makes it clear. I remember one person was explaining to me, if I draw a 7 and another 7, how do you know they're the same? And I had a flash of insight. He taught it very well. And I was like, oh yeah, those aren't the same. They're different in every way. The length of the top line is different. I just drew it. I mean, it's not the same. The angle between them is not the same. The length of the second line is not the same as the length of the first. I'm using concepts of first and second. Forget that. That's meta, but it's the same thing. It's like this 7 is nothing like that 7. In no way is it the same. And yet I can see that they're the same, because I have a basic understanding of sameness. I have a basic understanding of sevenness. And, of symbolism, right? Because obviously the 7 isn't the same as the concept. It's pointing at it. But in any case, I can see that they're the same and that they're not like the 4. But if I was an alien that came to Earth and you were just drawing symbols, would I for sure be able to tell? Like, if I draw a 7, and a 4, is the alien going to say, oh, you just drew 2 symbols and you drew the first one twice? Or would he say, you drew 3 symbols just now? I wonder what each of them means. There's nothing in what's been written there that makes it clear that these two are the same and this one's different, but you know that they are. You know that they are already. And Socrates is saying, because you have some knowledge that you're bringing to the table, we won't have time to go into it more right now. We have read, and I think we kind of skipped over those paragraphs because they are confusing. We didn't skip over them, but we didn't highlight them as much as we would need to for this. So maybe we'll go back. We'll take a vote in the after conversation about whether or not we'll go back and look at the Socratic attempt to make this argument, or it's at least tangentially quite similar argument. It might be worth doing. If it's true, it's a heck of a realization. And I think it is the same point he's trying to make about goodness. Goodness is something you recognize. How do you know? How do I know yellow? I mean, the word yellow, I was taught as a child, that's different. Obviously, he's not talking about that. He means you were taught the yellow block is yellow and the red block is red, and then you said the sun was yellow. How did you do that? Is there anything? What is similar about the block and the damn sun? They're not the same shade. They're not the same color exactly. How did you know that the sun was yellow because you knew that the block was yellow? There's nothing the same about the two. But obviously, they're both yellow. Yellow is basic. What makes conversation, thought, life, any coherent consciousness possible is that there's this basic element to some of these notions. And he says, we don't really make that mistake about the other things the way we do about good. So he calls it the naturalistic fallacy, because he says in the field of ethics, we keep forgetting that good is like yellow. It's just a basic concept. And now let's have all the debates. Is it over there or is it over there? Is this thing good or is that thing good? What are pleasurable things always good? That could still be true, right? But they're not equivalent. It's a different concept, and you just have it. You already have it. Or you can't, once you have it, you can't define it. You can't reduce it. It isn't a thing that could be broken apart and you could build up the pieces. It's not a composite. It doesn't have a definition because it's basic. That's it's a really cool idea, and it's a really strange idea because we never think in this way. We don't notice this thing, even though it might just be so obvious. Even when he's saying, he says it takes a moment of reflection to realize how true this is. It might be really an obvious truth, but we never pay any attention to it. So maybe we will take a moment to look back at the few paragraphs of Socrates where he's making this argument and the context in which he's doing it, because I think it would be worth highlighting this until we get it, until it's, it's not something that sticks with me too often. You know what I mean? Like, let's try and push it in there because it's somehow foreign to our current way of thinking that makes the idea seem strange. It's not clear to me why it would be wrong, though. Which puts it in a weird category of true and useful things. It's a true and useful thing that somehow isn't easy to assimilate into our brains because it's just not how we're used to thinking, or maybe it's required for thinking, and so we never notice it. I don't know. We'll keep examining it more and maybe come up with some arguments against the idea or something as we go. But I think it might be worth doing that. The other thing that was great about this essay is that he uses all of this terminology: simple, complex, analytic, synthetic. He has all sorts of notions here that come from a rich tradition in philosophy that he doesn't highlight and we wouldn't exactly notice, except that we're going to notice them more and more. And I think if we come back to read this essay after we look at a great deal of other things, we'll see that he's really standing on quite some tall pillars without highlighting that fact. And for that reason, it makes it it's a very pleasurable essay to read for a number of reasons. All right. Is the idea getting a little clear? It should be a weird idea. Is it getting clearer as we keep talking about it? What the heck he's trying to say about the quality of good and why it's indefinable? It should seem like a strange idea. I mean, most of these essays, it's like, oh, you're making an argument. Okay, I get what you're saying. I agree. I disagree. This one, it should sound pretty weird to us at first, just because we're really not used to thinking like this. Maybe Alana, with her emphasis on Plato, is, but it's an interesting idea. Okay, so we'll end this. We'll go into the after chat and we'll do that.